Get me Will Trent.
ABC Tuesday.
I don't even know where he is.
Will Trent is back.
You thought you could hide forever? Time to come home.
The series that's being called one of the best network procedurals.
We're going to solve this case.
Featuring new cast member Gina Rodriguez.
I'm a prosecutor. We deal in truth and facts.
Maybe everybody should try that, huh?
Will Trent, the 2-part season premiere, begins Tuesday on ABC and stream on Hulu.
The wrongs we must right. The fights we must win. The future we must secure together for our nation. This is what's in front of us. This determines what's next for all of us. We are Marines. We were made for this.
Welcome to Supernatural Circumstances, the podcast where we take you down the rabbit hole into the fantastic world of the strange, the paranormal, and the unknown. I'm Morgan Knutson.
And I'm Mike Brown. It's time to dim the lights and settle in. Come along with us on this week's adventure. And this week, our friend Paul Bestall is back from the UK, and he is going to talk to us about the Runcorn Poltergeist. And holy smackaroonies, the research that I've done so far is pretty interesting with this one, and it really grabbed me. And it's a case I wasn't familiar with.
I think that's going to be said for a lot of people, that they're not familiar with Runcorn Poltergeist, or the Byron Street Poltergeist as it's often referenced as. And I mean, what a great case to kick off the New Year's. If this does not send you into the coming year with insane questions, nothing will. It's a phenomenal case.
It's got me scratching my head. So let's get to Paul, because let's talk about this. It's nuts.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, Happy New Year's to everybody, because this is now New Year's, even though we're recording this a little bit early. So
you'll ruin the illusion.
Damn it, Mike.
Yeah.
So welcome, Paul. You are the first guest of 2025, and we're just so happy to have you back, because you're just one of our favorites. We're just going to have to admit that.
It's true.
Well, thank you very much. I'm humbled to be your first guest of the new year, and thank you once again for inviting me to return. I must be doing something right.
Well, I mean, every time we have a conversation, it's always so interesting. We talk about the coolest cases, and you just have the skinny on some of the neatest accounts throughout history. And in this particular case, I think one that people have not really read about to the degree that maybe they've read about the Battersea Poltergeist and the Enfield and things like that. But this is the Runcorn Poltergeist case, which I think a lot of people are probably very unfamiliar with. Even I had to do a bit of a deep dive, because my memory on it was a bit sketchy. But this one is really, really interesting. And for people who are interested in things like Battersea and Enfield and things like that, this really is one for the books, isn't it?
It's a classic, and it's a very strange case for me. I feel personally connected to this case, because if it wasn't for this case, Mysteries and Monsters wouldn't exist.
This is big.
That's kind of cool. So maybe provide a brief overview of this poltergeist case, so people who aren't familiar with it, like myself up until Morgan sent me some research, can figure out what's what.
Yes. So Runcorn is a nondescript small town in the county of Cheshire, over on the northwest of the UK, just down from Merseyside and Greater Manchester. It's one of those places that gets overlooked. You go through Runcorn to get to Manchester, Liverpool, Wales, places like that. So it's kind of a bit of a thoroughfare. And I'd completely missed this case. I don't know why. I'd owned the book that I rediscovered it in for 30 years.
Wow.
And I just was reading through it when I was quite ill. Whilst I was recuperating, I thought, I'll try and read some of my favourite ghost books. And I had the first edition of the Ghost Encyclopedia that John and Anne Spencer wrote in the 1980s, which I think is one of the biggest selling paranormal books of all time. I think it sold something like 750,000 copies. And at the time, I'd got about a handful of books, and I cross-referenced it, and it wasn't in any other book. And I thought, this is a bit odd. Is it not a real case? And so I began to scratch the surface, and then discovered that there was a 4-month infestation in this farmhouse on this quiet street in Runcorn in the early 1950s that ended up involving the BBC, the Society for Psychical Research. Time flew over from the States the year after.
Wow.
And did a 5-page spread in it at the time. Full colour and everything. Sent the reporter and the photographer over. It's one of those. It burnt really brightly for just over 4 months. Started in August, finished in December. You've got a couple of other strange events that are running parallel to it that are connected to the people in it. And as quickly as it appeared to annoy everybody, it buggered back off again from whence it came.
Typical of a lot of these types of cases. You know, I think, many times we are so bombarded with these magnificent Hollywood endings that these don't really end that way. You know, you're expecting this gigantic climax, but they really don't end that way. They typically start and stop for oftentimes what seems like no reason, which I'm sure there is a reason, but it seems like it's no reason, where it can be so severe and then just fall off completely. So who were these individuals? This revolved around the Jones family, am I right?
Yeah, so it was one of those typical sort of working class families where you'd got 5 people living in a 2-bedroomed house. So the grandfather and the grandson, Sam Jones, who was sort of the patriarch of the family, and John Glynn, who became known as the owner of the Poltergeist. Strangely, they shared a bed at that time. And so the first kind of notification that they were being visited was they'd gone to bed, and all of a sudden scratching started inside the dressing table drawer. And so they got up, investigated, it stopped, as it does. They got back in bed, started again, and this carried on for several hours. And that was one of those typical, just easing you in to really annoy the hell and terrify you for the next 4 months.
This young guy, he's a teenager, I think, John?
17.
He's got to spend the night every night with his grandpa in bed.
Yeah, 68.
That is what it is.
Who works on a farm, Mike.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it was another era. It was another era. But so they started to hear scratching inside the dresser drawers.
Yeah.
And things just kind of go sideways from there. What did they think it was at first?
Well, they didn't know. It was a typical kind of situation where, have they got mice? Have they got rats? Mm. Is it a practical joker? Is somebody... It gets to that point where you start questioning your own sanity, I think. And they were thinking, is somebody breaking into the house? Has someone decided to wire the house up with tripwires and things to cause these kind of problems? Mm. They were checking outside to make sure people weren't banging on the walls with hammers, such as the loudness of the knocks and the crashes that began. It became very quickly evident to everybody involved that there wasn't an outside physical explanation. And very quickly, as you can imagine in a very small town, obviously Runcorn is slightly larger than it was 70 years ago, but word quickly spread. And within a week or so, it was one of those wonderful examples of the locals just decided to stand outside every night and see what they could hear.
Well, that's nice. So there's creepy stuff going on inside your house. That's bad enough. And then you've got your creepy neighbors just kind of trying to figure out what's happening, standing outside staring at your house.
Yes. And so obviously the local newspaper, the Runcorn Guardian, which, as I say, I fell in love with this case to the point that I've been to the house.
Oh, wow.
Oh.
Still there. I've been to the Runcorn Library because when I rediscovered this case, I was so enamoured with it. I contacted Runcorn Library and I said, do you still have the newspaper archive for the time? Because it was the Runcorn Guardian that covered the story, which in those days was a fortnightly pamphlet. Having read it, there wasn't much going on, births, deaths, marriages, ghosts. It would seem, during this particular period. And they'd got all the copies of the paper from 1952 when it happened. And so I was able to look at the sort of first-hand accounts of everything. And it seemed to be quite the local attraction. Mm. And the library were brilliant. They said, yeah, fantastic. And I spoke with the wonderfully named lady called Rachel Tickle, which is a great name for a librarian.
It's a fantastic name. What a whimsical name.
I wonder if she has a sister named Tess. Anyway,
I never asked, Mike, but if I ever get in touch with her again, I'll check for you. And so she said, well, you're more than welcome to, if you want to come over, please come and see us, and you can dive into the microfiche archive and read as much as you want. So eventually, it took me about a year to get there. I think I went there 2019, and I spent the entire day there just going through the microfiche and looking at everything. And they'd also got a couple of locally published books. They've got an article from a local magazine called Cheshire Life, which revisited the case on the 5th anniversary. A couple of local ghost books that were written at the time. There's a strange thing that happens in the UK in the 1950s. We've got 2 or 3 really big poltergeist cases. The best example is, obviously, as you mentioned at the beginning, Morgan, the Battersea poltergeist. But that was lost for the best part of 50 years until, I'm trying to think who wrote the book. There was a book written about 10 years ago that predates all the sort of Danny Robbins podcasts, which was called The Poltergeist Prince. And I've forgotten the gentleman's name. But when I asked him if he wanted to do an interview about it, he said, I don't want to talk about this bloody ghost ever again in my life.
Oh, wow.
So it's probably why Danny Robbins decided to do his own show about it.
That's like, what was he so just blocked up about? Was it just he'd been interviewed too much, or was he what was going on?
I don't know. He was very polite, but he was very straight to the point.
Piss off,
shall we say?
Yeah.
Politely piss off, yeah. Piss off, please. And so that's how well mannered we are here. And I thought, oh well, that's a bit strange. But we've got several of these cases. We've got Runcorn, we've got Battersea, where because the person involved as the main investigator wasn't a household name or didn't write a book, neither of those 2 cases got the traction that they should have had in comparison with other more famous cases. And it's only sort of from the end of the 60s onwards where people like Peter Underwood and Andrew Green start writing about ghosts again. Sure. It's almost as if we've got this sort of post Harry Price's passing.
Right.
Till Peter Underwood kind of picks the baton up 20 years later. And so this is one of those cases that seems to be lost in time because of when it happened.
So it starts with scratching in the chest of drawers. How does it progress? Where does it go from there?
The bed starts shaking constantly. The furniture starts dancing around the room, as it's described. Chairs, the dresser, the chest of drawers, clocks, books, cups start whizzing around the room. Once again, it's one of those cases where there's stuff being thrown about all the time. Nobody gets seriously hurt. A couple of people get slight taps. As always, things seem to be thrown with great force, and then when they hit somebody, it's quite gentle, which is one of those strange things you get in some of these poltergeist cases. And it just starts building and building to the point where they were ending up with like 20 people in the house. So you'd have the 5 members of the family, 3 or 4 people from the BBC, 2 members of the church and the SPR, a couple of other local reporters, and then some family friends there for moral support.
Wow.
Things seemed to only happen when it was dark, and also it always seemed to be things that were easily reachable that were thrown, but nobody was caught doing anything, despite one person turning up and saying, oh, well, I saw somebody do it, and therefore everything's a hoax. And when they were asked about it, they wouldn't go into details after it.
As with all these other poltergeist cases, the minute there's a hint of somebody hoaxing something, everybody's just like, oh yeah, the whole thing was a hoax. It was never really a thing. And everybody just poo-poos it as, okay, it's not real because we saw somebody's hand go under the covers, after a book was thrown.
Those people don't like to tell you that the family moved out at the beginning of October and the stuff carried on till December.
Well, as we know, the people who are determined not to understand this stuff will make sure they are not understanding something by omitting as much as they can.
Of course, because it serves them not to have as much evidence as there has been, because, well, you have to be able to explain everything away.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and what's interesting, too, about this case, which for me paralleled with a few others that we've talked about here, is the fact that this was a case with multiple witnesses, number one. But who some of those witnesses actually were, I think, is really important. So people from the Society of Psychical Research, there was police officers who were witness to this and experienced the phenomenon, who walked away. There were people here that really didn't have a dog in the fight as to what was going on. Like, they're coming in expecting to be able to prove this thing wrong, and they could not. And I think that is a really important piece of this puzzle here, because many times we think, okay, well, the family says a lot of things, but there's a lot of people that came in here and were witnessing stuff that they could not explain.
Well, that's the great thing about it. I think, as I was saying at the beginning, you got the grandfather who would rather leap to the fact that they've got some kind of nighttime ninja visiting the house and deciding that this particular family are going to be teased by paranormal hoaxing, which makes even less sense, I think. Because they seem to be one of those families that were quite well known in the area for the right reasons. They didn't seem to have any sort of beef with anybody. And also there doesn't seem to be, other than this kind of post-war housing pressure, where, as we said, you've got a grandfather and his grandson having to share a bed purely for economical reasons. But there doesn't seem to be any of those kind of situations where perhaps, as we said in say, Enfield, you've got the sort of backstory of the family unit. The father had run off with somebody else. One of the children was in a special education centre. They were quite financially hard up. The dad would come round with his other woman constantly to the house. So you've got that kind of tension there, which could obviously one of those situations that could be part of the explanation as to why it kicked off. Whereas here, other than people, and to be fair, millions of people were living like that in the UK after the Second World War, especially places like Runcorn, because Runcorn had been bombed quite heavily. It was a chemicals factory area, and it's, close to Liverpool and Manchester. So it was a target for the Luftwaffe during the war. So a lot of people were hamstrung by both rationing, the financial impact of that post-war period, and also housing wasn't that easy to come by at that point because a lot of the areas had been flattened. Yeah,
that makes sense. And it leans to the idea of what may have been causing this, which is oftentimes stress and repressed emotion within the agent, what they call the agent of the poltergeist phenomenon. Is there more to it than that you've been able to find as to where was the center of this phenomenon, and why him? What was it within him that began to allow this activity to start happening?
Well, this is the thing. There doesn't seem to be any kind of psychological or family issue going on here. There was no sort of tension. The family all got on. There was no real sort of stress in this. This wasn't a situation that had just started. They'd been living like this for several years. I mean, you could say, well, he's 17, perhaps he's a bit fed up. Maybe he'd like to sleep in his own bed rather than sharing it with a 68-year-old man who works on a pig farm.
Yeah.
Maybe these are the things that teenagers at the beginning of the 1950s were not interested in. However, that kind of whole rock and roll boom hadn't hit yet.
Right.
So, it's not kind of, he's wanting to hang out at the Milk Bar and listen to Bill Haley and Buddy Holly. It even predates that kind of thing. They seem to all get on very well. There wasn't any kind of problems that I've been able to read about. All the interviews I've seen, they all seem very fond of each other in that kind of sense, which is also quite unusual. It's the 1950s. It's that kind of do as I say, not as I do era.
So you mentioned a pig farm. And was the pig farm that the grandfather worked at, was that the Crowther farm?
It was.
And so this sort of cropped up in my little bit of research as well about, so Crowther at one point, parallel to all the happenings that are going on at the Jones home, at the Crowther farm, he finds 3 of his pigs dead initially with their windpipes crushed. And over the next several days or week or whatever, all 53 of his pigs, I believe, die, which is fascinating. So all of this is kind of happening parallel to what's going on. There's a dancing, chest of drawers that's scratchy scratch and things being flung around houses. And now across town, there's dying pigs where Grandpa works.
What's happening?
Yeah. I think he'd literally started at the farm a couple of weeks before it all began at the house.
Wow.
I think it's one of those things that this might be something that just seems to be happening at the same time. It could be just coincidence. And I think sometimes
Right.
it depends on the reports you read, because there's a couple of things that happen alongside the haunting that have sort of got weaved in. And I've seen people say, oh, well, it was clearly what was going on at the farm that had followed him home. But there's no evidence of that. And obviously, this thing with the pigs as well is quite odd, like you say, Mike. He found 3 dead, and within, I think it was 14 days, all 53 pigs were dead.
Yeah.
And they'd all died in the same way of having their... Basically, they'd all been asphyxiated.
Wow.
Pigs are not the easiest creatures to kill quietly.
No.
No kidding.
Definitely not.
And the farm's not like one of those farms where it's, miles out the town centre. It's near enough for him to walk there every day. So, we're not talking 10 miles into the Peak District. It was, an hour's walk there, an hour's walk home. It wasn't that far out that you couldn't hear the squealing of animals in distress if required. The key thing here is that the Crowthers, Mr. and Mrs. Crowther, kept having a encounter or a series of encounters with this black, shapeless cloud that seemed to move around the farmyard.
That sounds familiar.
Right?
It wasn't just them that could see it. They have dogs, and the dogs would chase it round the farmyard, yapping at it, trying to catch it, and it would always try and twist up or dance up in the air. And they basically said it looked like a person, as if they were made of clouds, was one of the descriptions I think Mrs. Crowther said. And so you've got this going on whilst he's got all that going on at his home. And I think, as I said earlier on, a lot of people have kind of said this is John Glenn's ghost. But when you look at it, you would suggest, well, if anything, it seems that Sam, the grandfather, is the person that seems to be involved in more things that are happening.
Right.
It just seems to centre around his and John's room, because everybody seems to forget that it's Sam's room as well as John's.
So there was another person in the house. Her name was Ellen Whittle, and she was a boarder there. What happened to Ellen Whittle, and is this
All connected.
is this another thing that is just a coincidence, or because it all happened around this same time?
This is a very odd thing, Mike.
Oh, because the rest of it wasn't quite odd enough.
Right.
I can deal with those kind of things. Yeah. This is the thing that doesn't make sense to me. I think it's like 3 days after the family have had to move out entirely. Ellen, or Nellie as she was known to her friends, had decided for some reason to go walking up Runcorn Hill and plunge to her death.
So it's like it's a hilly, cliffy, rocky kind of place.
Yeah, but it's not that high, Mike, and it's October in the UK. Right?
Okay.
She's not going to be battered by 100-mile-an-hour winds and a freak snowstorm. It's probably a bit rainy.
Okay.
That's about as bad as it might be about
Right.
65, 70 degrees.
Yeah.
Her biggest worry is getting hit in the face with leaves.
Okay.
That's fair.
Okay.
That's as rough and as bad as the weather could possibly be. But yeah, nobody understood why she'd gone up there, because she was a pensioner.
Right.
And so nobody saw it happen. She was just found at the bottom of the hill where she'd clearly fallen to her death.
And she didn't die right away. Apparently, she died like the next day or something like that.
Yes. Yeah. She'd obviously suffered severe trauma from the fall, because this is the thing, they talk about Runcorn Hill. I think she fell about 50 feet.
Okay. That's far enough.
That's far.
Yeah.
Yep, that would do damage.
Especially if you land on your head or something. It doesn't really matter. There's never a good fall after 20 feet, really.
No.
And so that's one of those things that, because I think it happened sort of halfway between the start and the finish, and it wasn't really connected to the house, it often gets overlooked. But it is very odd.
Yeah, all these things taken together. To me, it was one of those ones, and I'm sure this is probably why it stood out to you. It was just like, wow, there's far more than meets the initial eye here. There's a lot going on, and we can call it coincidence if we want. We can. There's no real proof otherwise. But there's a mishmash of things that are going on that indicate something is up around that family, those people, that property, who knows what.
What's interesting to me too with this is the fact that with a lot of cases that I've looked into and investigated over the years, is that often all of these types of things run together, even if they're not intrinsically connected. Like what I've found within parapsychology is that if you've got people who are kind of just beating around a low emotional set point in general, then stuff is starting to happen to them anyway, right? You've got, you know, if people are, say, for example, you know, in a bad relationship or just left an abusive relationship and they're kind of in that negative headspace, then typically what kind of happens is that you get people manifesting things within that same array of emotion. So whether it be the poltergeist phenomenon that's happening, you know, attracting more incidents that seem to sort of mirror the pain that's already there, things like that. So even if the incidents in and of themselves aren't intrinsically tied to one person, it's not that much of a surprise to me that they've got chaos going on everywhere, because that type of activity and that type of like paranormal activity often mirrors the people's set point in general anyway. So that's what I kind of wonder, if these things aren't connected and it's not the same phenomenon, it would make sense to me that these people have chaos going on everywhere, because that's what's being mimicked in the house.
And it was quite strange as well, because the house now, it's virtually exactly the same. It's been painted white. You can jump out on that street, perhaps, and take some pictures and worry that people might see you and then quickly jump back in a car. I'm not telling you that I did that at all. Okay?
We're sure that you did.
And we want the pictures.
And I often think, do the family that live in that house now know anything about its history? Because it is essentially now just a normal, it's got loads of terraced houses built it. 600 yards from that house is the graveyard. And it's a very big graveyard as well in Runcorn. You know, it's not a small thing. So I'm not sure if the new houses have encroached on the old graveyard boundaries, or the graveyards just always had that sort of around it. But it is essentially, I don't know, 10-minute walk from the house to the graveyard. So it was essentially just a 2-up, 2-down house with a fairly big, substantial yard on a street that wasn't that particularly hectic either, which is a good thing for all the people that were stood outside every night staring up at the bedrooms.
Just a house on the street with a bunch of creeps outside.
What's crazy to me about some of these cases, particularly this one, is the public reaction. Like we're talking about, you know, I mean, now we've got TV programs and things like that we can sit down and watch and sort of feed that part of ourselves that wants to experience this stuff from a safe distance. But back then, I mean, there was obviously nothing on TV about any of this, or the radio or anything else. And I mean, this is kind of like a glimpse into something unknown and untouchable, I think, for a lot of people. You know, they get to stand outside the house and they're, you know, somewhat at a safe distance, but they still feel like they're involved and whatnot. What did they do about this crowd of people? Was it just something that dissipated once it stopped getting attention, or were they just hanging around even till death do us part with this thing?
They were there till the end.
Of course they were.
I've got one of the microfiches from 6 years ago now.
Oh, cool.
Oh, wow.
And if you can see there, you can see the police stood vigil and still it came, I believe.
Wow.
Wow, that's really cool.
And also there's a picture of John Glynn.
Wow.
And the dressing table where the noises came. This was printed 2 weeks after it started.
Wow.
At the end of August. So the police were already involved at that particular point.
And so quickly.
Yes.
You know, that's what's crazy, so quickly. I mean, out of all the years, 2+ decades now that I've been in parapsychology, I've not had it where outsiders get involved as quickly as they did in this time period, which is kind of interesting. Nowadays, when something like this happens, you don't hear about police being called.
There was a seance very early on too, right?
Yes.
Francis, I believe, was the medium. Was that the name of the medium?
Yes. The local spiritualist movement and the church and the police all essentially got involved at the same time.
Wow.
Oh, wow.
Which I think is because it was such a small town.
Yeah.
And this family was so well known and respected that everybody was like, what's going on with the Joneses? We like the Joneses. Let's see if they need a hand.
And in a small town, too, everybody's business is everybody else's. I mean...
Don't I know it?
Yeah, everybody's in everybody else's face and whatnot. So with the news articles, when these started to come out, did they start to tie other events in, like the pig farm and whatnot, or were they just completely focused on the house?
Sort of mentioned as asides. I don't think people were putting anything together. They were kind of looking at them as, well, this seems to involve these people, but they all don't seem to be connected because we don't think there's a ghost. I mean, the pig story, nobody sort of tied it back to the haunting till about 4 or 5 years later. There was a researcher called Richard Whittington Egan, I think, who was like a local ghostwriter who wrote about it. He was one of the first people who tied the pig death and Ellen's passing into it, because he said, this seems all very odd that two people connected with this haunting, one was involved with a mysterious death of pigs and the other one decided to walk up a hill and fall to her death.
Yeah.
Was she despondent? Like, what was the deal with her? Was she?
There was absolutely no indication. Everybody just said it was a tragic accident. But then again, everybody was saying, well, why? Nobody seemed to think, why she gone for a walk up a hill in autumn?
It makes you wonder what the lead up was.
Yeah.
And the same thing with the pigs, to me. You know, there's a story in that.
Someone killed them.
Someone killed them, yeah, or something killed them, or something happened. To me, that these two particular aspects of the case are really, really, really key, that nobody seems to have grabbed onto and looked into the way they should have at that time period. Because here you've got stuff going on around the home, and I think the worst that happened to John, from what I understand, was that he was like pulled out of his bed and dropped on the floor. And yet here outside of that, you've got these people that are... I mean, these are some really weird circumstances that if anything warranted police investigation, it was this. You know, why did this girl pass away? Who just horribly murdered all of these animals? Like, I mean, all of these things that should have been investigated. And it was almost like the phenomenon at the house to me completely took over. Like, I don't understand why... You know, the two key pieces here that I think really needed to be looked at were just, I mean, basically brushed off as well. Oh, well, that's weird. Yeah. It's odd to me. Paul, what's your take on that?
I completely agree. I think there's a bit more to this. And the thing is, this story got called John Glynn's Ghost. And yet, one other person is more involved in the other two things. Because it was Sam that allowed Nellie to be his lodger. Yeah. And it was Sam who worked on the farm where all the pigs died. And it was Sam and John's room that was haunted.
Yeah.
And everybody goes, oh, well, it can't be the 68-year-old grandfather, can it? It can't possibly be anything to do with him. I mean, it's all a bit...
Raising demons in the basement or something like that. And, you know.
Well, it is as well, because the other aspect of this is that the haunting and the cloud figure at the farm... The haunting finishes on either the day or the day after that the cloud figure appears at the farm and is seen to sort of evaporate into the air, being chased by the dog. So they both finish at the same time as well.
That's absolutely bizarre. That's absolutely bizarre. And it makes you wonder with most of these cases, as soon as you hear the word poltergeist, you start thinking about, you know, an agent that is... And for the audience that doesn't know what an agent is, it's kind of the clinical term for somebody who has that repressed energy that seems to be the cause or creator of the energy that's moving the stuff around the house. In this case, you almost begin to wonder whether, you know, if Sam, for example, was the agent or something like that, is this cloudy black shape something that is a projected thought, like the thought becomes the thinker, like we see in many negative entity hauntings, like Philip experiment, things like that. Like, you begin to wonder if this thing really did get out of control. That would be one of the theories that I would kind of put forward if we're looking at this like strictly from the paranormal perspective, is if you've got somebody that is, you know, in that obviously some sort of a negative state, or this wouldn't have been happening, and then this thing just gets worse and worse and worse with the stress of the people coming in and looking, and the cops and the press and this, that, and the other thing. I mean, it really compounds things to the point where I can understand how something like this could escalate even further.
It is, and it's frustrating because we know that the BBC did some recordings in the house. We don't know where they are. I mean, these things might happen. I mean, the Hexham Heads case recently became widespread again because the BBC have been doing some archive analysis, and they found the audio track and lost footage attached to a BBC concert that had just been tacked on the end of it.
Oh, wow.
That had been missing 49 years. And they found it about 8 weeks ago.
Oh, wow.
So it's one of those cases, like the Sorky poltergeist from Scotland that happens in the early 60s. There is BBC interview footage and a very strange event that happens during that interview in the BBC studio involving the Veronica Campbell case. We don't know where that footage is either.
Oh, that's interesting.
You would think someone, is weird things are happening while you're recording. You would think somebody would say, hey, you know what? We should probably save that somewhere. Just because. Just because it might be interesting to somebody later on.
I'm not sure what other countries did, but the BBC and ITV here in the UK, Mike, unfortunately used a lot of their recordings to re-record over.
Of course they did.
There's loads of, there's episodes of Doctor Who that haven't seen the light of day for 60 years. There's episodes of Morecambe and Wise show. There's like classic British television that's just vanished.
This gives me heart attacks, panic attacks. Why are you doing this?
It is strange. What can often occur, I mean, Bob Monkhouse, who was a legendary British comedian, I know this might sound like a bit of a tangent, but he was obsessed with television, and he, in the UK in the 1960s, he had 6 video recorders and 6 televisions in 6 different rooms in his house. And he taped everything, and he saved it, and he saved it, and he saved it. So eventually he had to build a giant shed in his mansion for all his stuff. And so when he died about 20 years ago, they started looking into his archive, and they found 200 lost episodes of shows.
Wow.
That he was the only person in the world that had saved it. It might still be in there, because I don't think they've gone through his entire archive yet. They've had it 20 years, and there's that much of it.
So yeah, somebody's just sun up to sundown going through things, thinking, "Why did this guy save all this?" Here he is, dusting his Hummels.
Yes. So it might be in Bob's shed somewhere still, but you never know. Stuff turns up all the time, so you don't know. And with the Hexham Heads thing as well, because that's a crazy case anyway. That's obviously linked to supernatural encounters and technically werewolves appearing in people's houses.
I think we should have you back to talk about this one.
Very much so. Yeah, that's a great case.
And so with this one, it's one of those that we've clearly got a pot of gold somewhere. Mm-hmm. We just don't know if it's still out there, because they recorded sort of the bangs and the crashes and the scratching at the time, and did interviews with everybody, the police, the church. So we can hope that maybe that recording is still somewhere gathering dust in the back of a cupboard or a former comedian's shed.
Do you think that maybe some of this stuff goes missing on purpose? Like, not to be too much of a conspiracy theorist, but I know with...
You, Morgan? No.
Oh, I know, right? Here we are doing a show called Supernatural Circumstances. But it makes me kind of wonder, like, I mean, because we hear about universities and stuff like that making evidence disappear, right? Like, we have people that are turning over bits and pieces of evidence and in regards to various paranormal subject matter, and it's just, we don't know where it went. Oops, somebody lost it in the back room. Oops. I kind of wonder if with cases like this, where, maybe one of the higher ups was like, this is just too weird for us, for our network. Like, this is, especially considering the time period that this came out. Like, I know there was a number of talk show hosts who refused to have certain channelers on, for instance, or they would have them on and then be like, nope, this is too weird for our audience. We don't want to do that. Like TED Talk, for instance, that was one that was, I mean, Mike, you and I, we've talked about that one on the show before, where TED has taken talks on parapsychology, and they're like, nope, we're not airing this, and they've buried it. And I kind of wonder in the case of, like, even the BBC at that time period, it's one thing to be able to tell this really cool story, but it's like, as soon as stuff starts happening during an interview, it's like, no, maybe, I don't know, like, maybe that shouldn't be aired. I don't know, like,
we don't want to scare people off their tea.
Right?
Well, I mean, if they can have strange interview with men claiming to channel aliens from Venus live on the BBC, I'm not sure why they'd be so frightened about a poltergeist.
Fair enough.
Which is one of the strangest pieces of footage you could ever wish to watch. out there. You can find it. Some of the worst acting I've ever seen, but fair play to them to keep trying to interview this chap in entirely serious nature. What are these messages saying to you? It wouldn't surprise me, because I think you often also have to look at the wider society aspect of this, that in the 1950s, the church in England was still quite influential.
Sure.
I mean, it's nowhere. Obviously, we would consider ourselves quite secular these days in the UK.
Right.
Those days, they would still have skin in the game in regards to deciding, what people could and couldn't do. Shops were closed on Sundays.
Sure.
Shops were closed all holidays.
Mm-hmm.
Songs of Praise was always on the BBC at 7 p.m. on a Sunday evening.
Great.
People were expected. If you didn't go to church, people thought you were odd. Even into the 1950s. I mean, it seems like a million years ago, but it's 70 years ago. And it shows you how much has changed, that you look at this case happening in 1952, and then 20 years later, the BBC is interviewing two guys claiming that vampires are running around Highgate Cemetery live on the BBC.
Which I love. Yeah.
And 200 people turn up with stakes and torches to kill everything.
Yeah.
And the BBC go, oh, it's nothing to do with me. And so it just shows you how quickly things have seemed to have completely changed in a generation in the UK from that kind of aspect. Maybe there was some of that. It wouldn't surprise me, because in those days you would have deeply religious people in charge of certain things at the BBC. Yeah. Maybe even members of the clergy on the BBC board back then.
Sure.
So anything that I would suggest would cast doubt upon the Almighty at that particular area may have been viewed quite negatively. But also, it would be interesting that the main SPR investigator here was the Reverend Stevens, who was the local vicar. Mm-hmm. So you got a vicar who was a ghost hunter.
Right.
Amazing.
Was that something that they didn't want to promote either?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's amazing. Like, when you get somebody, especially during that era, that's willing to go do that. Like, that's pretty amazing, really. I mean, you've got to be pretty open-minded.
Paul, do you have a pet theory about what was really going on there at Runcorn?
No.
Fair enough.
As poltergeist cases go, this one's quite odd, I think, because you've got the mysterious death and you've got all this weirdness going on at the farm, all sort of running parallel with it. And so many people being there. And also how quickly it is. As cases like this go, it seems to go from 0 to 60 really quickly and then just go.
And then back to naught.
Battersea lasted a couple of years. Enfield, even in its pomp, was only, I think it was 21 months. I mean, when you look at some of the reports, it makes it sound like it lasted for 5-6 years, but less than 2 years. And towards the last couple of months, it was drips and drabs. It had essentially just gone completely. This one, it's one of those. It seems to burn really brightly and then just go. And then everybody just seems to go, well, that was a bit strange, and just carried on with their life. And that was it. I think sometimes when it comes to poltergeist cases, the more I learn, the less I know, as daft as that sounds.
Yeah. No, it's
That's
true,
about
though.
it, though. Yeah.
Yeah.
What I used to think 10 years ago about Polts, I don't believe it now. I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all. I think this is a great example of a case where, yes, people would go, oh, well, there's a teenage boy involved, it must be him.
Exactly.
Whereas the more I read about it, the more I thought, this has got to have something to do with the grandfather. There's something going on here. I don't know what it is. And so that, I think, is often one of those aspects where you might have strange things going on. It's like Enfield. Everybody focuses on the two girls. They don't focus on the brother who was in the special education unit.
Yeah.
Who was an extremely troubled child. It's the girls, because they're, prepubescent young women. So they must be the reason why the house attracted a poltergeist. And the more cases I uncover, the more explanations don't explain everything. It doesn't have the same ingredients. And I think sometimes you can look at poltergeist cases and think, always has a teenage girl, always lasts 2 years. They must be prepubescent or coming into puberty. There's clearly family stress. And then as I've gone on and the more people I've spoken to and the more cases I've looked at, there seems to be less and less cases where you can apply those 3 rules. And therefore, that means that it's not the same ingredients in every case, which is less surprising to me than I think to some people, because then we begin to think, well, if it's not that, what the hell is it?
What a fascinating film this one would make.
Yes.
Like, really. If you wanted to tackle it, even Hollywoodize it, just sort of tell it straight up.
Yeah.
It would make for a pretty fascinating biographical account, you know.
For me, what the missing piece is here is not knowing enough about the background of the family. I feel like that, to me, is where the missing chunk is. Like, why them, right? And
what was Grandpa up to in his spare time?
Exactly.
Yeah.
That, to me, is where the missing piece is. Like, you look at these various cases, and I mean, the one reason why I wrote my book, Teaching the Living, was the fact that this comes back to the people always in some way, whether it's like this, the entity is out in the ether, or whether it's them, or whatever it is, it always comes back to the living person to some degree. Why are they attracting this? And I think, for me, it's this sort of overarching, nobody's talking about Grandpa. He seems to have this bizarre drama going on wherever he goes. Like there's something is up there. And at the time, I know, like, it wasn't really until Scott Rogo and Dr. William Roll really started to delve into understanding the role of, like, the people and this phenomenon that people start to actually look at this. So I think a lot of these cases, when you go back and research them, those aspects kind of remain ignored a little bit. Everybody's really focused on the phenomenon. So, I mean, we might not ever know what it is with Grandpa Joe here, but I think something is going on, and I think that would be the first place I would go if I was digging this up again, or if this was a case of during present day.
I think this is the thing here. If it's all right with you, I just want to read you this excerpt from the article in 1957, which kind of gives us a bit more depth to this. So this is just after Mr. Crowther, who owns the farm, had seen the black cloud wandering about for the first time. Mr. Crowther told no one of his experience, but a day or two later his wife told him that she too had seen a dark cloud clouding about the yard. Nor was that all. Both of the Crowthers had heard occasional scratchings coming from the drawers of a desk which stood in their kitchen, and a row of jam jars on the pantry shelf mysteriously overturned. One evening, some weeks later, Mr. Crowther had a most alarming encounter with the cloud in his own kitchen. He was sitting there alone in the twilight when, as he suddenly looked up, he saw the misty black shape hovering menacingly at the far side of the room. He leapt up and made for the light switch, and as he did so, he brushed past the cloud, and two prongs, which he said felt solid like blunt sticks, went to stab his throat. The instant he switched on the light, the cloud disappeared. It was at that time that Mr. Jones urgently requested his presence at Byron Street, and as he arrived, there, stretched like a vaporous black pile across the bed in which John Glynn lay, he saw the same malignant clown.
Oy, oy, oy.
Wow.
No, thank you.
Yeah, that to me sums up exactly what we were just talking about. Really, is that this does have something to do with him. I mean, to me, it's just undeniable.
There's no way it doesn't.
Yeah. To me, it's absolutely undeniable. Well, Paul, this has been absolutely phenomenal, and thank you so much for lending some light onto this strange case. I'm sure everybody's got way more questions than they do answers, which is exactly how we want people. This has been amazing. Paul, where can people find you? Talk about your podcast, because it is absolutely one of the best paranormal podcasts out there. It's phenomenal, guys. Go subscribe to it. I'm going to let you talk a little bit about it.
Oh, thank you very much. Yes, you can find me as Mysteries and Monsters across most social media platforms, and also all good podcast sites, and probably some dodgy ones as well, carry the show as well. And it's released every week. It'll be 6 years in March, not missed a week. Come hell, high water, COVID, hospital visits, family members being ill, I've still managed to get an episode out every week, and long may that continue. I like to challenge myself.
Yeah.
Oh, it's wonderful. It's a fantastic show. This has been so interesting, and yes, we're having you back for that other case as well. That we have to dig into that later on in the next couple months.
There's no way we can't just bypass that.
No, it's not gonna. Well, it's not going to happen. So that's it. You're booked again. So
yeah. Well, strangely enough, the Hexham Heads I'm very attached to, not literally, because that case was how I actually met Dr. David Clarke, the ufologist, because here in Sheffield we have a book festival every year called Off the Shelf, and Richard McLean Smith, who does the podcast Unexplained, was promoting his book that had just come out after the first 2 seasons, I think. And so he was giving a talk in Sheffield that David Clarke was hosting. Nice. And so we went to watch it, and what subject was Richard McLean Smith talking about? It was the Hexham Heads.
Oh, for heaven's sakes! Well, that's what we're doing next. There we go, people. Big spoiler alert for later on in the year.
Another house I visited secretly.
Yeah.
Not secret anymore.
I want to come over there and go visiting places with you. That's what I know, right? Do. I've got my Tower of London shirt on from the last time I was there, and
we'll get you a cup of tea and some and a Yorkshire pudding.
Well, I've never been to your neck of the woods. I would love to see it one day.
And you'll fit right in, Mike. You've never been to God's Own County? What's wrong with you?
No.
Money. That's what's wrong with us.
I've only been there once. Yeah, money is the problem.
Well, I would be humbled and honoured to act as your guide the next time you visit our shores.
Nice.
That would be wonderful.
No, thank you for having me.
Well, this has been amazing.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me again. Thank you for your time and your conversation. It's always an absolute pleasure. And I want to wish you all the best for the upcoming new year.
Of course, another fantastic conversation with Mr. Bestall. Thank you, sir, for coming onto the show with us. And we're so glad that he joined us for the first show of our new year.
Oh, gosh, yeah. I mean, this case is so strange, and he's got such a personal connection to it, which I think is really interesting. You know, we often talk about all these different cases and people are kind of relaying facts, but it's a totally different thing when the person's really gotten their hands dirty, so to speak, with a case like this.
Yeah, I love it. I love it when we are able to talk to somebody who's been to the places and talk to people and those kind of things. It's, you know, it's one thing to tell a story that's, you know, different levels away from you, but having, you know, stood out on the street and taken pictures, maybe not, of the actual house and those kind of things, visited the place. It's really cool. I love that. I love that stuff.
Well, and what do you make of this entire case? I mean, there are so many pieces to this, and what has left me questioning this whole thing, and we talked a bit about this when we had Paul here, was the fact that there seems to be chunks of missing information, but also the idea that this got so violent relatively quickly. Like Paul was saying, this did not happen over a humongous span of time. It was something like 10 weeks. This was really, really short. And yet all of these really odd things were going on. What's your take on this? Do you think that these events were related?
Oh, I do. I mean, I'd be an ignoramus, especially with what Paul read us at the end of things, you know, that, you know, okay. So if it was hoaxed, it was a planned hoax among all of these people that were, you know, everybody, Grandpa and Mr. Crowther would have had to been involved. But why? What's the benefit? They didn't gain anything. They didn't gain financially. They didn't even really gain attention. Maybe for a very brief time they did, but it wasn't sustained, so they didn't just keep milking it. So I don't think it's that. I wonder about Grandpa. I wonder about Grandpa Jones, and I'm wondering, did he have something maybe psychologically, spiritually? Did he have a drinking problem? Sometimes, you know, I'm somebody who has had that in my life, and so I know I was at a spiritual ebb for a very long time with that, and as a result, I had some dark stuff in my life going on. I was drawing it to me. So was there something going on with that grandfather? And maybe was he doing something on purpose to draw that toward him? and realized, whoa, I've gotten in over my head and maybe I should back off on that. And that's why it ended so quickly.
Ooh, that's something too that I hadn't thought about. The idea that maybe he was involved in something that was a little bit more deliberate. I mean, it's totally possible. Especially in these small communities. And I mean, I grew up in a very small community. I grew up in Leduc, Alberta, which at the time was literally one strip of stores and all farms around it. I mean, there was nothing.
Right. Yeah.
And not only is it a place where everybody kind of knows your business, but it's also a place where there's not a whole lot to do either. And I mean, as we know, when people are sitting around with not a lot to do, sometimes they can get into some trouble, and they dabble, right? And it kind of makes you wonder if there was something going on. The other thing that caught me in what Paul was saying was the proximity to the cemetery, and not in the sense that it's these spirits
cemetery
that are stuck there.
Haunting.
Yeah, exactly, and that's not what I'm implying at all, because we know that's not accurate. But what's interesting to me is that I find that these cemeteries and burial grounds and things like that are often chosen not because of like the proximity to something or anything like that, but they're actually picked because people have witnessed phenomenon there before. There's an energy about them that's special, or things have gone on there in the past, and that land is chosen to be burial ground and things like that. So I mean, there's so many factors here that I feel like really need to be investigated, with Grandpa Jones at the top of the list.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I really wish there was somebody who knew more about Grandpa Jones, I mean, it's 1952, so 70 years ago. Most of the people who would remember anything are dead. I mean, even young John, if he was 17 at the time, that would make him 87. Yeah. So, The one good thing with historical cases like this, and I don't know if it applies to this particular one or not. I'm sure if it did, Paul would have found it, because he's so thorough with everything he does. Is the fact that a lot of these small communities, and I mean, it's this way in Edmonton, Alberta as well. When you go to the archives and you look up certain addresses, sometimes what'll happen is you'll hit it lucky, and the archivist will have a stack of things that have been donated to the archives in and around that property. For example, one researcher we had a number of years ago had this house that was built in 1910 in a very old part of Edmonton, and the family, because they'd been in Edmonton for so long, had actually donated everything from Christmas cards to letters to layouts when they redid the house and whatever, all to the local archive. And I mean, it would be there's no other trace of these people living in this home apart from what was donated to the archives. So it makes me wonder, if there is some sort of a store like that somewhere that somebody has of little bits and pieces that you can start to begin to piece together who these people were and what might have been going on at the time. Sadly, in this case, I really don't know if there would be, especially the way Paul described that, with it being just another house on another street kind of thing, as we mentioned a million times with creeps standing outside. But yeah, it was just like a nondescript house. It's maybe it's not really a noteworthy property at all, and nobody, but it would be so fun to discover a cache of things, like you say. I don't know if that's going to happen here. So
yeah, and you never know. Like, I mean, I definitely didn't think it was going to happen with this house here in Edmonton, because there's nothing unique about it other than the fact that entire area is old. And people just kind of keep this stuff, like, but little things can really make a difference, like get well cards, for instance. Somebody's donated get well cards. Okay, now we've got a period of sickness that we can kind of track as to
we can kind of dig into that. Yeah.
Exactly. So there's little things that, like, as investigators that we kind of do, that you can begin to sort of break down a timeline, even though it wasn't something that's publicized. But again, it all comes back to that archive. So, if nobody saved it, you never know. But this case has me has me so curious and so stumped.
Me too. I'm looking forward to Paul discussing this more in something that's upcoming. I'm not going to blow up his spot, but
it is coming.
Yes.
Hopefully summer, so we'll see.
We will see. Thank you for joining us on this actually eerie expedition, dear listeners.
And remember, there is no line between the natural and the supernatural. All is consciousness. Until next time, stay curious, friends.
Supernatural Circumstances is a co-production of Entity Seeker Paranormal Research and Teachings and Good Egg Studios. This podcast is a part of the Curious Cast podcast network. Theme music by Corey Johnson of Catalyst Records in Edmonton, Alberta.